Welcome to Curry Public Library and our display of what people wore when. This is a display of costumes from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. These costumes, and I do have to clarify that everything that you will be seeing are indeed costumes. They are not the actual clothing from these different time periods. So if you see me touching the garments, you'll know that I'm touching costumes, things that were designed specifically for people to wear. So they can be touched. And right now we are looking at the medieval time period. And this time period is more late medieval, and so 15th century. And the suit that's over here, the men's suit, is the only example within our exhibit of something that is more, not quite as upper class. Let's just put it that way. So this is more of a working garment. There aren't too many, in fact, there aren't any more like that within our collection. In contrast, we have this gorgeous gown that, as you can see, is definitely not meant for any use but the idle rich. We can see these long trailing sleeves. People would be hampered by wearing a garment such as this, which means that they are rich enough not to have to do anything. And there's some inner sleeves in there. And we have our shoes, the poulaines, they are called. You can see how the toe curls up. We've all seen representations of this before. What's interesting is that it may not look very practical, but speaking of the upper class and maybe the working people, almost everybody wore a shoe that had a curled up toe. This is not, one of the more extreme examples of it, but it is an example of that particular style, which was popular among all classes. Right here, we have examples of Renaissance clothing, and the doublet and breeches combination and the gown are, we would consider those more of early Renaissance, so say the late 15th century. So there's less than 100 years between our medieval and our Renaissance examples here. So those are much broader time periods. These are a little bit more condensed. And with these, you can see that both the men's and the women's garments feature layers. So the fabrics are layered. This was due to increasing fabric technology of the time. One thing that you'll notice about the men's costume is just how ostentatious it is. You see that men truly love to dress up, perhaps even more than the women did at the time. And with the women's gown, you'll notice that there is a higher waistline in that, along with the medieval gown. As we're going along, watch the waistlines in the women's dresses. They will change, they will go up and down throughout history. So the collar, that floral lace ruff that we have on the mannequin at the far end, well, there is an interesting story to why the collars of the Elizabethan time. So that's an example of a little later on in the Renaissance. But during the Elizabethan times, we've all seen images of those humongous collars. And something that I have heard which I am not, I haven't fact-checked this, but I think it's an interesting theory, is that during this time, of course, people didn't bathe as frequently as we do now. Oftentimes people had body lice. And the collars were designed to keep the body lice off the face. So it was a barrier between what was going on in your body and what was going on in your head. I don't know if that's true, but that sounds true. And the codpiece right there on the same mannequin, it used to be a necessary garment. Men used to wear hose that were not joined together at the top, so it was just two legs, and they needed something to cover up the middle. And so the codpiece was designed for that, but like that floral lace ruff, which could have been a garment, a necessary garment to wear, became more of an ornamentation. And they both grew in size throughout this time period. So now we see the Cavalier time period. And these examples, I would say, are from around the 1630s. And this, yes, so the 1630s. So this dress, we see the waistline, you know how I was talking about looking at the gowns and seeing the waistlines go up and down. And this waistline is much more at the natural waist. And the style of this gown is a bit more subdued than, say, the high Elizabethan period. While men's clothing regained its very glamorous aspect, very detailed. And then, of course, if you look at the Cavalier style hat, you'll see, too, that the gorgeous feathers on that and the rich detail and ornamentation is just very highly indicative of this time period of men's quest for glamour. All right. We have come to the 18th century, and the fashions that you see on display here were used throughout much of the 18th century. So we're talking about the 1700s here. The dress that you see, which is called an open robe style, it was a style that was used in many different incarnations of dress throughout the century. This is a very good example. And it's very highly detailed as well. And again, we're looking at layers, as you'll see, especially since the Renaissance, with the fabric technology increasing, you'll see more layers in clothing. You can see, and it is called an open robe. The design of these was that this part was almost like a fitted jacket, a fitted coat that fastened up the torso and then opened out. And so then you would see the layer of petticoat underneath here. And then with the men's clothing, we're starting to shift from the doublet and breeches combo that we had in the other two examples, or other three examples, and we're now shifting toward a coat. So this is your first incarnation of the men's suit that we know today. And these breeches are made in a style called fall front. Here we'll see that again on another example a little further in history. panniers here. Remember those long trailing sleeves that we saw with the medieval gown as this example of being so rich, you really don't need to wear anything that makes any sense whatsoever. Here's another example of that. For some reason, it was a style for women's hips to be as wide as possible. The front part of the body and the back were narrow, but the hips were very wide. And this is more of a moderate example. You'll see in old paintings panniers that go much further, extend much further away from the body than this. I do want to point out, before we move on, that all of these styles are European styles, or what I would call a Western style. And since the 1700s, and now we're into the 1800s, these could be considered Western styles. People in America and in the New World were wearing these styles as well. But these are certainly not representative of any other culture styles around the world. So, like I said, we are now entering the 1800s, so early 19th century. This gown and this bonnet are, I would say, the 18 teens we're looking at. And the 1700s were known throughout the Western world as a time of revolution. And here in the early 19th century, we're still kind of reeling from that. The Western civilization is still shifting, and the gown styles for women, or the dress styles for women, have obviously changed a lot. We see the first example of something that is looser and less structured, so gives a woman a little bit more movement. And this is an example of some loosening social mores, a time where people were starting to loosen up a little bit in society. However, we couldn't be too loose. You could see this bonnet. It's a beautiful bonnet, and it would certainly keep the sun off your face. However, if this thing was on your head and the ribbon was tied under your chin, you would have no vision out the sides whatsoever. So, as you can see, when it's tied and these sides come forward, there is no peripheral vision. So, in a sense, women could loosen up a little bit, but not too much.
Okay, go.
All right. So we're into the mid-19th century, and this is not, say, the Civil War time or the 1850s, 1860s. This is more early mid, I would say the 1830s. But already we're seeing a huge shift from the 18 teens to where looser, unrestrictive or not as restrictive clothing, we are back to fully restrictive clothing. And this, in many ways, is a response to that period of revolution. We're now entering another change in governance and rulership, and entering the Victorian time period where rulers are trying to take back that power that they once held. And so we see this reflected in the more restrictive garments of this area. And we would, as you look at this dress, you can see that a lot of undergarments need to be utilized for this look too. So not only would you need to have a corset or something tucking your waist in to really make this dress as full as it was designed to be. There were petticoats, many, many, many layers of petticoats worn under this, and often these were made of horsehair, and they were very heavy. So not only do you have your tight shoulders, there isn't much movement for the arms, and you have your tight waist. You're also wearing very heavy undergarments underneath here too. And the men were not left out of that either. They had to wear increasingly restrictive garments too, although this is a beautiful example of a really elegant suit, and we're starting to see this suit look more like the modern suit, and we'll see this evolution of men's suiting as we go on. And again, we've got the fall front trousers here, and lots of ways to dress this up with your frilly collars, and usually a vest worn under this too. But gorgeous, however, starting to get back into that Victorian feel, the restrictive feeling. So I've been using the word restrictive a lot, and we can see where I'm heading with this. We're now into the late 19th century, high Victorian. It's roughly the 1880s right here. The bustle has come back into vogue, but just a little bustle. This is not a huge bustle, as we can see. But still, this outline, this shape, will pretty much be out of vogue by the next decade. But buttoned up, we can see that she is completely covered from the neck on down to the feet. And the men, again, don't really get off very lightly either. This suit, as we're seeing, is becoming more and more like the shape of men's suiting of today. But you notice how high up this buttons up. And of course, they're wearing collars too, tight collars. And these short lapels, these sleeves are slightly puffed here, but these are really tight shoulder openings. This does not really give much room for movement right here. And the corset. So this corset, which is a boned corset, means it has this flat metal, it's called boning, but it's a metal panel that runs up and down the front. And this was to create the S-bend shape. So think the Gibson girl with the flat metal panel right here. It's pushing. So it's pushing the waist in, so it's pushing forward. So the torso comes forward and the hips go back, which creates that Gibson girl S-bend shape, which of course is not very healthy. And this isn't quite that type of corset, but it's very similar to it, because this does have a metal piece that comes up through here. Sits low on the bust line and comes down lower on the abdomen to make sure that those hips get pushed back. So I'd like you to look at this waistline again. I should have discussed this in the early 19th century with the high waist, especially in the early 19th century. You have that true empire waist, where the waist is just up under the bust line. And in this, it's high-waisted again. And this is an example of a dress that is reflective of one of many different movements in the early 20th century. As we get into the 20th century, we see that more fashions are available to people, especially women. It's the particular style of clothing is not quite as set for everybody, or people with money, obviously, is what we're looking at here. This movement right here is part of the Orientalism movement, and which focused on gorgeous colors and fabrics and designs, lots of layers again, and a looser fit too. So we just looked at the corset. Now we're looking at a piece that does not require that type of corset. In fact, this dress doesn't really require too many supportive undergarments at all, which women did find freeing. And the suit here is also an example of the choice that people had. So this suit was more of a country or sporting wear suit that men could wear. And then the bathing suit, this one is made of cotton. Most bathing suits of that time would have been made out of wool, and men and women both had wool bathing suits and wore, especially women, wore quite a few different accessories involved in it, hose or tights and a cap and bathing shoes. So essentially, even if you were spending the day at the beach, you would still be covered almost head to toe. But at least you could spend the day at the beach and be in the water. To my personal favorite time period for fashion, which is the 1930s. Now, we may think that high fashion in the 30s is an oxymoron because of the depression that ravaged pretty much that entire decade. But as you can see, this dress right here, this is the first dress we have come to that doesn't require dozens of yards of fabric. There is less material involved in making this dress, and during this time period too, it was the fashion to cut the fabric on the diagonal, which is the bias. So this is an example of a bias cut dress, which, because of the way that the fabric would fall, it's much more body clinging. So we've done a lot of talking about foundation garments in clothing, and this is an example of clothing that not only does it not require, as say the dress of the 1910 to 1919, doesn't quite require as much foundational garments, but there is no possible way you could have many garments on underneath this. So, but it is a very, very elegant look. The men's suit too is very elegant as well. And now we are seeing that the suit has pretty much reached the modern day suit. So suit styles do, as we know, come and go. So this one is double-breasted. Of course, we get into times where it's more the fashion to be single-breasted, but the double-breasted does come back. And these nice lapels right here, the peaked lapel. So this particular style will come back again. This is here to stay. And the hat, too, this cute little teardrop hat, is another example of using less fabric. And women's hairstyles, as we think about the 1920s, we think about the cropped hair. And this, in the 30s, many women retain that short hair length. So this would be a good hat for those short hairstyles. All right, now we are into our most modern garments that we have here, the 1960s. This is the last decade or time period that we are featuring. And I picked these out because I wanted to highlight the fact that quite a bit of the 60s was not hippie style. A lot of people think of the 60s and just think of flowing garments. The early 60s, which these two pieces are representative of, is an extension of the 1950s. So we have this gown here that that is more like the 1950s styling. And I talked earlier about how in the 20th century, clothing was loosening up, becoming varied. People had more choices about what they might want to wear. The 50s was a time period, it's this short blip in the 20th century, where people went back to a feeling of constriction and conformity. So as an example of constriction, because this is strapless, this has to be a really tight fit right here. And women did go back to wearing more layers underneath their clothing. So girdles were huge back then. Almost everybody wore a girdle, including women with perfect figures. They all wore girdles too. In fact, some men wore girdles. And so as an example of constriction, we have that, although it is a very, very pretty piece. And as an example of conformity, we have this suit here, which is reminiscent of that gray flannel suit of the 50s and early 60s, which was pretty much the uniform of the male office worker. And they all were very, very similar styles back then. Thank you so much for taking this tour with me. I have really enjoyed showing off all of these wonderful fashions. I would like to be able to thank the different, all the different people who created these costumes. However, that was just not information that we got from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, but a lot of hard work went into making each one of these. And I do want to send a shout out to whoever those people are. I really appreciate all your hard work. And I want to thank the Tamis Day Foundation for giving us the grant to make all of this possible. And I'd like to thank my coworkers too for everything, all the hard work that they put into this, especially my library director, Jeremy Skinner, who created the layout of what you see of the display and made it into such a museum quality piece. And my other coworkers who helped out, like Rebecca with her promotion, and and Brandon and Darlene, who worked to help construct this too. And I would like to thank you too, just the opportunity that I had as the exhibit curator to have somebody to share my passion with.